Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is fancy. Before we start looking at some definitions or ways to use this verb, I want to note that fancy is not commonly thought of as a verb in the United States. This is really more commonly used in the United Kingdom or Great Britain. So, uh, actually, all the verbs that I'm going to talk about this week are going to be verbs that maybe you would more commonly hear in Great Britain, in England, in other countries where the English instruction sort of comes from the UK. So, as you can tell by my accent, I am not from the United Kingdom, and I don't consider myself an expert on this. This has required me to do some reading, and I really appreciated the suggestion I received from a subscriber about covering some verbs that are more commonly heard in the UK. So, with that, let's begin our look at fancy as a verb. One way fancy is used as a verb is to mean to feel a desire or feel a liking for something. So, we're going to look at some examples of this later, but commonly you might hear fancy used in a question in place of a would you like. It could have a similar meaning in that way. A second way you might hear fancy used is to mean to find another person attractive. I know I've heard this verb used in movies as one character is suggesting that they find another character in the film very attractive. A third way you can use fancy as a verb is to mean to imagine or think. And I've got an example sentence a little later that will help us illustrate that particular meaning. You should know that fancy is a regular verb. To make the progressive tense, all we're going to do is add ing to form fancying. The past tense and participle forms are going to require a spelling change. So, since this verb ends in a Y, we're going to drop the Y, add an I before we add the ed. Now, the base verb, fancy, e, ends in a vowel sound. So our past tense ending is just going to make a D sound. Fancied, fancied. Okay. Now, you'll be happy to know no additional meanings through phrasal verbs. And that's going to allow us to practice using fancy in a couple different ways. So, another question I've received recently from a student was regarding how to use would. would. This is a modal, and there are actually a number of ways to use this particular modal. I'm just going to focus on two of those ways today that I think sort of fit with this particular verb, and I'll include other uses with would with some future verbs down the road. So, one way we use would is for want or inclination. So, we're going to take a look at some examples with this, and I'm going to point out with the two ways we're using would today, our structure is going to be the same no matter what our subject is. So, we're going to use um, our subject, then we're going to use would, and then we'll use the base verb. Okay, so an example here. He would fancy himself as a midfielder. Okay, now this particular sentence ties back to that third definition, to think or imagine. And this is a sentence I saw as I looked for some examples in news articles of how fancy is being used. And the bigger picture here was a certain soccer player or football player, if you're outside the United States, was um, really wanting So they were inclined to play midfield, but they had been playing other positions. So again, this is what kind of connects back to the idea of want or inclination. So they want to think of themselves and they want to play midfield. And I think in this particular story, he was not getting that opportunity. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence when you're talking about a want or what someone is inclined to do, we're just going to place not after the modal would, and you might hear some people use the contraction wouldn't. And an example of that, she wouldn't fancy a date with him, right? She is not interested in having a romantic date with this particular person. Finally, if you want to ask a yes or no question, asking about what someone wants or what they are inclined to do, start with would, then we'll have our subject, and then our base verb. You can see that in the example. Would you fancy a cup of tea? So again, essentially asking, do you desire, do you want a cup of tea? And I have to tell you, this yes or no question is how I think about the verb fancy being used. And again, that might be heavily influenced by movies, TV shows, literature, that again usually is set in Great Britain. Another usage for the modal would is as sort of a past form for will or be going to. And with these types of situations, generally what is happening is someone is talking about what someone said or did in the past, and that action is sort of being I guess they're referring to something that would take place in the future. And so I feel like it's probably better if we look at our example here. So, an example. She said that she would fancy some dessert. Okay. So again, this goes back to that like, want sort of situation here. Um, and so she's communicating, yes, I will eat dessert in the future. Okay. But because we're saying she said, I'm relaying a past event, something that was said in the past, but it's about the future. That's why I'm using would. We can also make negatives in the same way. An example here, the candidates told voters they wouldn't fancy a tax increase. Okay, so in this particular sentence, again, we have the past action. A candidate or a group of candidates here are talking to potential voters, and they're essentially saying, I don't like the idea of increasing taxes. I'm not in favor of this. I'm not inclined to do this. But again, because we're talking about what was said in the past, that's why we're making that sort of change from saying will fancy or will not, won't fancy in this case, a tax increase to wouldn't fancy. So when I think of this particular usage for would, I really think of a lot of sentences beginning with a person said or a person told something, right? So that's telling us, okay, this is in the past. And then we're noting what someone else might do in the future. Now, let's spend just a little time looking at some words and a phrase related to our verb fancy. So when I hear the word fancy, I generally think of an adjective. It's got the exact same spelling, um, same pronunciation. Sorry, I was trying to remember. There are two things I usually tell you: same spelling, same pronunciation. And when people use fancy as an adjective, they might be describing something that is elaborate or sophisticated, expensive, of a high quality. And with all of these other adjectives, as I'm describing fancy, um, many times it's because we want others to be impressed, to think, wow, that is elaborate, sophisticated, or expensive, or of high quality. Okay, so let's look at two examples of fancy being used as an adjective. She bought a fancy dress for the party, right? This could be expensive, could be of high quality. Um, and again, it might be that she wants others to think that this particular dress is of high quality or quite expensive. Another example, are you going to the fancy restaurant to celebrate, right? So here, maybe a sophisticated, right? Something a little nicer than a McDonald's. Okay. Uh, Fancy could also be used as a noun. So again, same spelling, same pronunciation. Many times when you hear this used as a noun, it's referring to some belief or idea that is unfounded. It's not supported by research or by evidence. It's just, might think of it as some crazy idea that a particular person has. An example of this noun in a sentence: doctors must address fads and fancies with their patients to keep them healthy and safe. And I think we've seen this a lot over the course of the pandemic. Some people would use social media to talk about, I'm doing this, or I'm taking this and putting this into my body to keep me safe from COVID. And some of those things were extremely dangerous. They were not proven to be a remedy or a way to treat COVID, but they were still doing it. And that's the idea here. So, um, unfortunately, doctors have to be talking to their patients about kind of like the latest, greatest, maybe easy way to lose weight, right? Those sometimes are really quite dangerous. And those ideas or tactics or foods aren't proven to actually help do what they say they're going to do. Another phrase you might hear with fancy is to strike someone's fancy, and this means to appeal to someone. Um, an example of this: you can have whatever flavor strikes your fancy. So, in this particular sentence, maybe imagine being at an ice cream parlor, right? And there are all kinds of options. I say, it's my treat. And I'm telling you, pick whatever flavor appeals to you, whatever one you would like to have. And I'm going to note, I'm noticing a typo here that always makes me kind of angry at myself when I see it, but there shouldn't be an apostrophe there with the strikes. I don't know what I was thinking, but I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great day.